Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
This afternoon's Torah portion is called Kiddushim, or the Holiness Code. The Holiness Code is a set of commandments given by God to the Israelites. The code contains several instructions, each requiring to be adhered to in order to remain holy. These instructions include respecting one's father and mother, keeping the Sabbath, not stealing, and many more. Some of these rules are obvious and easy to follow. Of course, we should honor our fathers and mothers. Yet some others are harder to follow. For example, you shall not render an unfair decision. This is difficult to do. We make unfair decisions all the time. Thus, we may not always be holy, for we may fail to uphold the commandments in Kiddushim. So that is why we have Yom Kippur, to atone for our sins, to own up to our mistakes, and to seek forgiveness from God. But what about God? Is God holy? One may say, well, of course God is holy. God is God. And that's a totally reasonable conclusion. However, God may not be considered holy according to God's own standards as they are articulated in the Holiness Code. As I mentioned earlier, one of Kiddushim's commandments is you shall not render an unfair decision. Yet there are lots of times that God seems to do so. For example, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. In this passage, God destroyed the entire city of Sodom because there weren't enough righteous people who lived there, an act that could be seen as an unfair decision. However, God did decide to spare the righteous man Lot and his wife and children, the only caveat being they could not look back after destruction. This is good. Yet, Lot's wife looks back anyway and gets punished for her lack of faith. Punished not in any reasonable way, but in a horrific way, transformed into a pillar of salt, simply for turning around. This could be interpreted as an egregiously unfair decision on God's part. In addition to the commandment not to render an unfair decision, Kiddushim also instructs not to bear a grudge. Yet God contradicts God's own rule many times throughout the Torah. One example is regarding the instructions that God gives the Israelites on how to treat neighboring countries. The Israelites were longtime enemies of two of their neighbors, the Moabites and the Amalekites. God instructs the Israelites to never forget the hostility of the Israelites' neighbors. But isn't this contradictory to God's commandment in Kiddushim to never bear a grudge? Finally, in Kiddushim, God instructs us to make sure that the poor and the stranger have enough of what they need to live a comfortable life. Yet God allows people to be poor on earth, again, failing to uphold God's own rule. So why is that? Why does God break God's own rules? And since God does break God's own rules, why should we be expected to uphold them? It's because God, like ourselves, isn't always perfect. God can make mistakes too. In fact, the ancient rabbis imagined that God has God's own private prayer. And it goes, "May it be my will that my mercy will overcome my anger, and my mercy will flow over my attribute of judgment, and that I engage with my children with mercy, and that I treat them with leniency." Here, God is praying that God can be God's best self for us. And so perhaps rather than just us seeking forgiveness from God, we must also forgive God for God's own shortcomings, for when God doesn't adhere to Kiddushim, a mutual reconciliation with the eternal. Thus, perhaps God really is holy after all, and so are we. That despite our mistakes, we can still be forgiven and be holy like God. Thank you.
Shana Tova. Yasher Koach.